Hey adventurer, welcome back to the Weary Wanderer. Tonight we're spiritually and hygienically lowering ourselves into the sandals of Kenaman, an ancient Egyptian tomb robber, as he embarks on one particularly sweaty, sacrilegious, and generally ill-advised day of archaeological redistribution. Before we start chipping away at limestone and any lingering sense of divine justice, please do take a moment to subscribe if you genuinely enjoy watching history's less glamorous professions get the miserable spotlight they so richly deserve. And for a bit of fun before the suffering, let me know in the comments what valuable artifact you'd most like to discover in your own backyard. No questions asked, of course. Now find a comfortable spot. Perhaps pour yourself something that isn't gritty Nile water, and let's begin our descent into the thankfully bygone era of high-stakes, low-reward grave robbing. Trust me, you'll appreciate your modern amenities after this. The concept of a good night's sleep was as alien to Kenaman as, well, respecting the dead. Sleep wasn't a restorative journey into the peaceful land of Duat. It was more like being intermittently clubbed into unconsciousness in a sauna filled with regret and the ghosts of minor officials whose eternal rest he'd, shall we say, disturbed. Tonight, or rather this pre-dawn, was no different. He was sprawled on a reed mat that had seen better millennia, possibly during the reign of a pharaoh whose tomb he'd already discreetly emptied. The mat was less a comfort and more a suggestion of where the dirt floor ended and his sleeping space began. It lay in the corner of a dilapidated mud brick hovel he shared with two other members of his less-than-merry band. Knocked, a wiry individual whose snores sounded like a hippo trying to swallow a sack of angry cats, and the new kid, Bak, who mostly just whimpered. The air in their charming abode wasn't just air. It was a thick, unmoving entity, saturated with the intimate perfumes of unwashed bodies, stale beer, the faint, lingering aroma of scared sweat, and the ever-present dust of Egypt that coated everything, including the inside of your lungs. Even with the sun still stubbornly refusing to show its face, the heat was a physical presence, a damp, heavy blanket promising another day of being slowly cooked in one's own juices. Kenaman imagined the wealthy nobles probably had special cooling rooms, fanned by servants. He, on the other hand, had Nakt's breath, which, at this proximity, could probably wilt papyrus at 10 paces. Something tickled his ear. He slapped at it with a grunt, not bothering to open his eyes. Scorpion? Aggressive beetle? Or just another piece of the ceiling, deciding to rejoin the earth from whence it came? Frankly, as long as it wasn't a necropolis guard with a keen interest in his early morning routine, he was past caring. This was luxury compared to some nights spent pressed against the cold, unyielding stone of a half-dug tunnel, the silence broken only by the skittering of things best left unidentified. At least here, the skittering things probably weren't guardian spirits. Probably. The awakening, when it came, wasn't gentle. There was no melodious call of a servant, no soft sunlight filtering through fine linen curtains. Instead, it was the rhythmic, hacking cough of Amose, the fourth member of their crew, who slept in an adjacent, equally squalid lean-to. Amose's cough was a familiar sound, a wet, rasping declaration that his lungs were staging a mutiny. Each bark sounded like a chisel blow against stone, and Kenaman idly wondered if Amos was trying to excavate his own insides. It was a cough that spoke of too many nights breathing dust in cramped, unventilated spaces, a professional hazard as common as a scar or a healthy fear of the Medjay. Kenaman didn't so much wake up as surrender to the inevitable. His eyes cracked open, gritty and sore, to the oppressive darkness. For a blissful moment, he didn't know where he was, or who he was, or why the universe had apparently singled him out for such exquisite discomfort. Then memory, that cruel taskmaster, returned with all the subtlety of a dropped sarcophagus lid. He was Kenaman. He robbed tombs. and it was time to get up and do it again, because Ty and the children had the unfortunate habit of needing to eat. His back, a faithful companion in misery, sent a series of sharp, protesting jolts up his spine as he levered himself into a sitting position. Every muscle screamed a tiny, articulate curse. The 35 years he'd lived felt like 135, each one spent hauling rocks uphill, probably for a pharaoh who'd then complain about the gradient. "By the sun-baked scrotum of Ra," he muttered, a morning prayer of sorts. The air tasted like old sandals. Nacht, beside him, snorted violently and flopped over, his arm thumping Kenneman squarely in the ribs. It was like being hit by a sack of dried fish, surprisingly bony and just as fragrant. Kenneman shoved the offending limb away with a silent curse, not wanting to risk waking the human hippo. Waking Nacht before it was strictly necessary was like deliberately poking a grumpy crocodile with a short stick, generally unrewarding and potentially hazardous to your limbs. Now for the dark fumbling, a ritual performed purely by touch and memory. His tunic, a length of once white linen now roughly the color of dirt and despair, was crumpled beside the mat. It felt damp, not from dew. There was no dew in this furnace, but from the previous day's sweat, having achieved a state of permanent clamminess. Pulling it on was like embracing a cool, slightly hostile slug. Delightful. He groped for his sandals, worn thin and smooth, their leather ties stiff. His calloused feet, cracked and permanently stained, slid into them with the familiarity of long practice. One of the ties snapped as he tried to secure it. Of course it did. Why would today be any different? He'd have to tie a knot in it, making it shorter, tighter, and just that little bit more likely to rub a new blister onto his ankle. A small, fresh misery to start the day. Perfect. His tools were next. They were the instruments of his trade, his livelihood, and potentially his doom if used carelessly. He kept them wrapped in a piece of rough goat hide beneath his mat, a couple of heavy copper chisels already blunted from their last outing, a stout wooden mallet, its head scarred and split, a small curved pry bar that had once been part of a chariot axle, and a few wedges. His fingers, rough and surprisingly sensitive, danced over them, checking for new damage, for the reassuring solidity of metal and wood. One chisel felt particularly dull. He made a mental note. He'd have to spend precious minutes trying to sharpen it on a piece of sandstone later, a task as enjoyable as giving a crocodile a tooth cleaning. He also had a water skin, currently depressingly light, and a small hard loaf of bread, which felt like it could be used to knock out a small animal, or perhaps one of the more irritating tomb guardians. Sustenance. His internal monologue was, as always, a litany of immediate, grim practicalities. That damn cough of Moses is worse. If he starts spitting blood in a narrow passage, it's not just a health hazard, it's a bloody inconvenience. He could feel the dull ache in his left shoulder, a memento from a falling stone chip 2 nights ago. That's going to be fun when I'm swinging the mallet. He thought of Pacer, their shifty, sweat-prone priestly contact. Pacer wants this done tonight, which means he's either got a buyer lined up or the guards are sniffing too close to his incense-reeking robes for comfort. Either way, hurry, hurry, hurry. And always, the low, grinding worry about the children. Another week of this, maybe 2, and I'll have enough for that extra grain. Unless Back drops a gold bracelet down a fissure because he's seen a shadow he thinks is Anubis's left buttock. He could hear Back muttering in his sleep now, something about, "Don't take my liver, I'm using it." The kid was going to be a problem. He was too green, too prone to seeing omens in every gust of wind or creak of settling sand. Kenneman preferred his tomb robbers jaded and world-weary, like himself. Less screaming when you accidentally disturbed a nest of bats. He took a tentative sip from the water skin. The water was warm and tasted faintly of goat, but it was wet. That was its primary, and currently only, virtue. He stood, his knees cracking like dry twigs. The hovel was still steeped in blackness. The only hint of the approaching dawn, a very faint, almost imperceptible lightening of the oppressive dark to the east, visible through a crack in the wall. It was the hour of ghosts and thieves, the liminal space between the true night and the brutal day. Kenneman, a man who regularly trafficked with the belongings of the former and embodied the latter, felt right at home, which is to say, thoroughly miserable. He nudged Knockett with his foot, a solid, uncompromising prod. "Time to go disappoint our ancestors," Kenneman grunted, his voice raspy. Knock just groaned and swatted vaguely in his direction. The day was beginning, in all its pre-dawn horror. And somewhere, in a silent, sealed chamber beneath the sands, a minor noble was about to have his eternal peace rudely and probably unprofitably interrupted. Kenneman hoped he at least had some decent jewelry. It would be a shame to go to all this trouble for a few chipped pots and a curse that might or might not turn his liver into a fig. The nudge from Kenneman's foot had all the subtlety of a minor rockslide, and Nacht responded with a grunt that suggested he was deeply offended by the concept of wakefulness. 5 more minutes, he mumbled into the mat, his voice thick with the remnants of whatever passed for dreams in his skull, probably visions of an endless supply of beer or a particularly cooperative goat. "The only thing you'll get in 5 more minutes is a medjay spear through your snoring gullet if we don't move," Kenneman retorted, his tone as dry as the crumbling mud brick around them. He didn't wait for a coherent response, already turning his attention to Amos, who was now engaged in a coughing fit that sounded like he was trying to dislodge a small, furry animal from his esophagus. Bach, the nervous youngster, was already awake, his eyes wide and darting around the dim hovel as if expecting a malevolent spirit to offer him morning greetings. Kid looked like a startled gazelle, if gazelles were prone to sweaty palms and a talent for tripping over their own feet. First light was a rumor, a pathetic smear of bruised purple and sickly orange on the eastern horizon, doing little to dispel the pre-dawn gloom. It was just enough to transform shapes from terrifyingly unknown to depressingly familiar. This was the hour when the sensible folk of Thebes were still lost in slumber, dreaming of bountiful harvests, or perhaps, ironically, of peaceful afterlives. Kenneman and his crew, however, were embarking on their daily quest to make those afterlives slightly less well-appointed. Their immediate tasks were performed with the grim efficiency of men who knew that dawdling could mean the difference between a meager profit and a very public, very painful execution. Kenneman hoisted their shared tool roll, a heavy, awkward bundle of disillusionment wrapped in goat hide, onto his already protesting shoulder. The weight settled with a familiar, unwelcome pressure, reminding his spine that it, too, had dreams, mostly involving not being attached to Kenneman. Nacht, having finally decided that the threat of impalement slightly outweighed the allure of the mat, was grumbling as he strapped a heavy bag of waterskins, mostly empty, to be filled at a discreet, scummy well on the edge of the desert, across his broad chest. Amos, his coughing subsiding into a series of wet wheezes, shouldered a crowbar that looked almost as weary as he did. Bach clutched a small, flickering oil lamp, his knuckles white. The lamp was more of a fire hazard and a beacon for unwanted attention than a genuine source of illumination. But Pacer insisted. Pacer also insisted on getting his cut before any potential divine retribution, which told you everything you needed to know about Pacer. Their bodies, cold and stiff from the inadequate rest and the lingering chill of the desert night, a deceitful coolness that would soon be forgotten in the face of the sun's furnace, protested each movement. Kenneman's back sent sharp, stabbing reminders of its existence with every step. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, insistent rhythm. The knot he'd tied in his sandal strap was already digging into his ankle with the enthusiastic malice of a tiny, leather-bound demon. He imagined his joints were filled not with fluid, but with sand and tiny, angry scorpions. "Right," he grunted, more to himself than the others. "Let's go desecrate some history." The early morning held its own unique bouquet of miseries. The first was the overwhelming need for stealth. Every footfall had to be measured, every dislodged pebble a potential alarm bell in the vast sleeping necropolis. The silence of the city of the dead was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind across the sands, the distant bark of a feral dog, or a Moses' heroic attempts to hack up a lung without alerting every guard within a 2-mile radius. It was a silence that amplified every clumsy stumble, every muttered curse. Then there was the air itself, that brief, deceptive period where the night's cold hadn't quite surrendered to the day's inferno. It carried the scent of dust, dry stone, and something else. A faint, dry, ancient smell that Kenneman associated with disturbed tombs. The smell of old linen, desiccated offerings, and perhaps, just perhaps, the lingering disapproval of millennia-dead nobles. It wasn't a smell that inspired confidence. They moved like ghosts, or rather, like very clumsy asthmatic ghosts, sticking to the shadows of rocky outcrops and the crumbling walls of forgotten chapels. The necropolis stretched before them, a silent, sprawling city of eternal slumber, its grandeur mocking their furtive, grubby enterprise. Towering pylons and the dark maws of cliff tombs stood silhouetted against the slowly brightening sky. It was beautiful, in a terrifying, "you really shouldn't be here" kind of way. Kenneman spared it a moment of detached appreciation, the kind one might give to a particularly impressive cobra just before it decided to strike. This brief window, before the sun truly asserted its brutal authority, and before the necropolis overseers and their Medjay patrols began their rounds, was their best, if not only, chance to reach their target unseen. Naturally, something had to go wrong. It was a rule, practically etched onto the back of the Great Sphinx. Today it was Kenneman's already abused sandal. As they navigated a patch of loose scree on a slight incline, the makeshift knot in the leather tie, stressed beyond its humble capabilities, gave up the ghost with a soft, pathetic snap. Kenneman's foot slid, and he pitched forward, the tool roll tumbling from his shoulder with a dull metallic clang that sounded in the pre-dawn stillness, like the celebratory crashing of cymbals at a festival he definitely wasn't invited to. He managed to break his fall with his hands, scraping them raw on the sharp stones, but the damage was done. "Sweet suffering Horus," Noct hissed, his voice a low growl. "Trying to wake the entire afterlife, Kenneman? Or just the local garrison?" Bach jumped, letting out a small squeak, and nearly dropped the lamp. Amosi just coughed, a dry, sarcastic sound this time. Kenneman ignored them, his face a mask of stoic irritation as he retrieved the offending sandal. The tie was a lost cause. "Of all the rotten, flea-bitten luck," he muttered, examining the frayed leather. He could already feel a blister forming on his ankle from the earlier friction, and now he'd be walking with one foot half bare, or trying to fashion yet another temporary fix that would last all of 10 steps. This was not just an inconvenience, it was a delay, and a painful one at that. Each step on the sharp, unforgiving desert floor would be a fresh little torment. Anyone got a spare piece of cord? Or perhaps a divine intervention? No one offered either. Noct was too busy glaring. Amos was too busy trying to breathe. Bach looked like he might offer his own tunic as a sacrifice if it would make the scary men stop being angry. Kenneman sighed, a gust of pure exasperation. He rummaged in the small pouch at his belt, eventually producing a strip of dried sinew he usually used for minor tool repairs. It wasn't ideal. It was stiff and prone to snapping. But it would have to do. As he crouched, awkwardly trying to thread the sinew through the sandal's loop with his scraped and dirt-caked fingers, the first true rays of sunlight speared over the distant cliffs, painting the scene in harsh, unforgiving gold. The brief coolness was already a fading memory, replaced by the promise of impending heat. "We're burning daylight we don't have," Noct grumbled, shifting his weight impatiently. "Passer will have our hides if we're late, and the Medjay will have our heads." Passer can stuff his impatience up his sacred... Well, never mind, Kenneman shot back, finally getting the sinew secured, though it felt about as reliable as a politician's promise. And yes, Nacht, I'm acutely aware of the Medjay. Their interior decorating preferences, mostly involving human heads on spikes, are quite memorable. The interaction was typical, terse, practical, and laced with the kind of hostility that blooms between men who are bound together by desperation and mutual distrust rather than any genuine affection. Kenneman, by virtue of his experience and slightly sharper intellect, a low bar, admittedly, was the de facto planner, the one who scouted the tombs and figured out the entry points. Nakat was the muscle, quick to anger and slow to comprehend, but strong as an ox, and useful for shifting heavy debris. Ahmose was the seasoned warrior, his cough a constant reminder of the job's toll, but he had a good ear for the sounds of approaching patrols or shifting rock. And Bach was ballast, mostly, hopefully trainable ballast. Kenneman stood, testing his repaired sandal. It felt terrible, naturally. His scraped hand stung, his shoulder ached, his back creaked like an old temple door. He could already feel the familiar tendrils of exhaustion beginning to wrap around him, despite the day having barely begun. This wasn't just physical fatigue. It was a soul-deep weariness, the cumulative effect of years spent crawling through the earth, stealing from the dead, and constantly looking over his shoulder. The few positive aspects of the morning, the fleeting coolness, the stark beauty of the necropolis at dawn, were already buried under a pile of fresh discomforts and anxieties. "All right," Kenneman said, his voice flat. "Target's another half-mile that way. Try not to announce our arrival to every jackal-headed god and his brother this time, Nacht. And Bach, if you see a shadow, it's probably just a rock. Don't scream. Unless it's a scorpion in your loincloth. Then, by all means, scream. Briefly." He took the lead, his gait uneven thanks to the sabotaged sandal. The sun climbed higher, its heat beginning to bite. The work, the real work, hadn't even started, and already Kenneman felt like he'd wrestled a crocodile and lost. He had a sinking feeling that this day was going to be particularly proficient in the art of misery. The only question was whether the tomb would yield enough to make the suffering even marginally worthwhile. Historically speaking, the odds weren't great. The half-mile trek to their designated spot of illicit excavation felt more like 5. Each step with Kenneman's creatively repaired sandal was a small, unique adventure in chafing and uneven pressure. The sun, no longer a shy maiden peeking over the horizon, had transformed into a brazen harlot, flaunting its full, blistering power. It beat down on the sand, which reflected the heat right back up, cooking them from below while the sky furnace baked them from above. The sparse, skeletal shadows they'd clung to earlier had shrunk to pathetic, useless slivers. Welcome to Egypt, land of eternal sunshine and equally eternal suffering, for those not lounging by a shaded pool with a palm fan. Their target, as identified by Pacer's less than reliable information network, probably some other equally corrupt, low-level temple functionary with gambling debts, was the tomb of a certain Neferkare, a scribe of the royal granaries from a few dynasties back. Apparently, Neferkare had been wealthy enough to afford a decent burial, but not prominent enough for his final resting place to be guarded with the same zeal as, say, a pharaoh's. Or so the theory went. Kenneman had learned that theories, especially Pacer's, often crumbled faster than ancient mud brick under a determined chisel. Reaching the supposed vicinity involved a final, sweaty scramble up a desolate wadi, its sides littered with loose rock and the kind of thorny, desiccated bushes that seemed to exist solely to snag clothing and flesh. Kenneman's breathing was shallow and rapid, each inhale drawing in air that felt like it had been preheated in a kiln. His shoulder throbbed in time with his pulse, a dull, angry drumbeat. Nacht, despite his bulk, seemed marginally less affected, though his tunic was plastered to his back with sweat, and his grumbling had escalated from specific complaints to a general, all-encompassing monologue of discontent directed at the gods, the heat, Kenneman, and a particularly annoying fly that had taken a fancy to his left nostril. Amos was a portrait in dusty, wheezing misery, pausing every few steps to lean on his crowbar and cough raggedly. Back, bless his terrified cotton socks, looked like he was about to either faint or start confessing to crimes he hadn't even committed yet. "This is it," Kenneman panted, gesturing with his chin towards a section of unremarkable cliff face. According to Pacer's chicken scratch map, the entrance should be hidden behind that cluster of boulders. He didn't sound convinced. Pacer's maps had a tendency to be more aspirational than accurate. The cluster of boulders looked like every other cluster of boulders in this god-forsaken landscape. Heavy, ancient, and entirely unwilling to be moved. The physical demands, already significant, now escalated into outright brutality. Their first task was to clear enough smaller rocks and debris to even see if there was a sealed entrance, or if Pacer had, once again, sent them on a wild goose chase fueled by cheap beer and optimistic hearsay. The sun climbed, and with it, the temperature. Metal tools left in the sun for more than a few seconds became too hot to touch. The glare off the pale rock was blinding, forcing them to squint, which only deepened the lines of frustration etched around their eyes. Dust, fine as powdered bone, rose with every movement, coating their sweaty skin, inflaming their nostrils, and adding a gritty texture to their already parched mouths. Swarms of persistent flies, drawn by the aroma of hot toiling man-flesh, became their constant companions, dive-bombing eyes, ears, and any available patch of exposed skin. Kenneman mentally composed a detailed curse upon the god who had invented flies, then mentally amended it to include the god who invented Pacer. Hours seemed to pass, measured in strained grunts, the grating scrape of stone on stone, and the rhythmic thud of Amos's coughing. Kenneman, knocked, and Amos worked in a grim, reluctant concert, prying, heaving, and rolling rocks that seemed determined to stay put. Back was assigned the task of lookout, which mostly involved him standing awkwardly, trying to look inconspicuous while simultaneously radiating enough nervous energy to power a small obelisk. Kenneman's back screamed with every lift. His repaired sandal offered no support, and his scraped hands were now raw and bleeding in new places. The initial hope that this might be a quick job had long since evaporated, leaving behind the familiar residue of bitter resignation. "Anything?" Nacht grunted, wiping a forearm across his brow, leaving a muddy smear. "Because I'm fairly certain my liver is starting to cook." "Patience, Nacht," Kenneman said, though his own was wearing thinner than his sandal sole. "Tomb robbing isn't a sprint. It's a marathon of misery with a questionable prize at the end, assuming there is an end, or a prize." He peered at a section of rock that looked slightly less natural than the surrounding cliff. Maybe here. It was then that exhaustion, the ever-present saboteur, decided to make its move. Amos, attempting to lever a particularly stubborn rock, put too much strain on his aging crowbar. With a sickening crack, not of stone, but of stressed wood, the shaft of the crowbar splintered, sending Amos stumbling backward with a cry, narrowly avoiding falling onto a pile of sharp-edged debris. The rock, momentarily dislodged, settled back with a dull thud. The crowbar was now significantly shorter and about as useful as a one-legged man in an asp-kicking contest. "My crowbar," Amose lamented, staring at the fractured tool with genuine despair. It was probably older than Bach. "The good one?" Kenneman closed his eyes for a moment. Of course. Why would they have two functioning crowbars when one broken one would add so much more flavor to their suffering? "Are you hurt, Amose?" he asked, the concern in his voice battling with a rising tide of irritation. An injured man was a liability, a very slow, complaining liability. "Just my pride," Amos wheezed, clutching his side, "and possibly a rib. This thing had seen me through many coughs violently. Discussions with stubborn stonework. This was their first real mistake, born of weariness and faulty equipment. Now they were down a crucial tool. Any heavy prying would be significantly harder. Small errors, Kenneman knew, had a nasty habit of breeding larger problems, like flies on a corpse. This would slow them down, making them work harder, deeper into the hottest part of the day, increasing the risk of discovery with every passing sun-drenched minute. As if on cue, Nacht, who had been scouting a little further along the cliff base, let out a low whistle. "Kenneman, you might want to see this." There was a new urgency in Nacht's tone that cut through Kenneman's annoyance. He limped over, back trailing nervously behind like a poorly trained dog. Nacht pointed towards the sand at the base of the cliff, a few paces from where they'd been toiling. There, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, were faint impressions. Footprints, not their own, and a small, almost buried pile of date pits. Fresh ones. "Rivals," Nacht stated, spitting onto the sand. "Or the Medjay have developed a sudden taste for snacking while on patrol." Kenneman knelt, examining the signs. The footprints were partially scuffed, deliberately obscured, but definitely there. Someone else had been here recently, probably scoping out the same tomb. This changed things. The pressure, already significant thanks to Pacer's impatience and the general illegality of their chosen profession, ratcheted up another notch. They weren't just racing the sun and the guards anymore. They were potentially racing another crew. And encounters with rival tomb robbers were rarely settled with polite negotiation and a shared waterskin. More often, they involved sharp implements and a distinct lack of witnesses. "They haven't tried to break in yet," Kenneman observed, his voice grim. "Or if they did, they didn't get far. No fresh chippings. They were just looking." This was a sliver of good news, if one could call it that. Maybe they decided it was too much work. Or maybe they're coming back tonight, better equipped. Or maybe, Nacht growled, his hand instinctively going to the heavy cudgel tucked into his belt. "They're watching us right now, waiting for us to do the hard work." Bach made a small, strangled noise. Kenneman shot him a glare that could curdle milk. "Unlikely. Too exposed here. But we don't have the luxury of time anymore. We find the entrance, get what we can, and get out, before Neferkare has more visitors than the festival of Opet." And then, as if the gods were amusing themselves by dangling tiny morsels of hope just to snatch them away, came the false promise. As Kenneman returned to the spot he'd suspected, running his scraped fingers over the rock face, he felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible give under one of the boulders they hadn't yet managed to shift. And beneath it, a straight line, too straight to be natural. A seam. "Here," he hissed, a spark of something that might have been excitement, or possibly just advanced heat stroke, in his voice. "This is it. And look." He pointed to the base of the boulder. "It's not as deeply set as I thought. We might be able to roll it." For a glorious 10 minutes, it seemed their luck had turned. With renewed, albeit desperate, energy, they focused their efforts on this one stubborn stone. Nacht, grunting like a boar in mating season, put his massive shoulders to it. Kennemon and Ahmos, using the larger unbroken end of his ruined crowbar, levered from the sides. Even Bach was enlisted, pushing with all his meager might, his face a mask of terrified exertion. The boulder groaned, resisted, then with a final agonizing screech of protest, it shifted. It rolled not far, but enough to reveal a dark, rectangular opening behind it, unmistakably man-made. The entrance. A wave of something that wasn't quite relief, but perhaps a slight lessening of immediate despair, washed over Kenneman. "Well, I'll be a son of a jackal." he breathed, peering into the gloom. Pazer was right for once. Mark this day, lads. It's a miracle. The miracle lasted approximately as long as it took for Kenneman to stick his head into the opening. The initial passage was small, barely wide enough to crawl through, and sloped steeply downwards, and it was blocked. Not by a simple mud brick wall, which would have been inconvenient but manageable. No, this was blocked by a solid plug of granite, a massive, unforgiving stone aurochs of a blockage, clearly designed by someone who really didn't want visitors. It was the kind of barrier that laughed at copper chisels and sneered at weary muscles. The brief flicker of hope died a quick, painful death, replaced by a familiar, crushing weight. Kenneman pulled his head out, his face grim, dust and cobwebs in his hair. "Well?" Nak demanded, still panting. Kenneman just looked at him, then at the oppressive sun, then at the fractured crowbar. He picked up a small stone and tossed it at the granite plug. It made a dull, final-sounding thud. "Neferkare, the scribe of royal granaries," Kenneman announced with a voice dripping with sarcastic reverence, apparently invested more in his eternal security than he did in his granary inventory. "We're going to need bigger chisels, and possibly a new religion, because the gods of thieves clearly hate us today." The sun, no longer content with merely cooking them, had evidently decided to take a more personal, malevolent interest in their suffering. It hung directly overhead, a monstrous, incandescent eye, searing the world with its pitiless gaze. There was no shade to be found, not even a sliver. The rocks around them shimmered with heat haze, distorting the already bleak landscape into a wavering, dreamlike hell. Metal tools, if left exposed for even a minute, became instruments of fiery torture, branding skin on contact. Kenneman learned this the hard way when he absent-mindedly reached for a chisel that had been sunning itself, yelping and snatching his hand back with a fresh blister already blooming on his palm. From then on, tools were religiously kept under a scrap of hide, or, in moments of dire need, tucked under a buttock to preserve their coolness at the expense of personal dignity. Dignity, however, was a luxury none of them could currently afford. Visibility was a cruel joke. The glare bouncing off the pale limestone cliffs was so intense, it felt like tiny needles were being driven into their eyeballs. Every glance towards the horizon was an exercise in pain, leaving dancing spots in their vision and a throbbing ache behind their temples. The flies, emboldened by the heat and the rich aroma of 4 slowly dehydrating humans, had reached peak aggression. They were no longer content with merely buzzing around. They launched kamikaze attacks into eyes, ears, and nostrils, crawling with frantic, tickling insistence. Slapping at them was a futile gesture, expending precious energy for a microsecond of relief before the buzzing horde returned, seemingly more numerous and more determined. Amos's coughs now had a new, desperate edge as he tried to expel both phlegm and the occasional inhaled insect. And then there was the granite plug, Neferkar's monument to stubbornness. It sat there, impassive and immense, mocking their feeble efforts. This was the task everyone had instinctively dreaded from the moment Kenneman had announced its existence. Tackling a solid granite blockage with a couple of worn copper chisels, one of which was now ominously dull thanks to Kenneman's earlier oversight and lack of adequate sharpening tools. A wooden mallet that threatened to disintegrate with every enthusiastic blow, and the broken remnants of a crowbar, was less a job and more a form of ritualized self-punishment. Kenneman, gritting his teeth against the fire in his shoulder and the raw screaming of his abused hands, took the first shift, lying half in, half out of the narrow passage, the sun baking his exposed legs, while the cool, dead air of the tomb entrance offered scant relief to his upper body. He positioned the tip of his least blunted chisel against the unyielding stone. "Right, Neferkare, you tight-fisted son of a sand flea," he muttered. "Let's see if your eternity is as solid as you think." He brought the mallet down, thud, a pathetic sound. A faint dusting of granite powder, no bigger than a pinch of salt, fell away. His hands vibrated from the impact, sending jolts of pain up his arms. The granite remained defiantly, insultingly intact. He struck again. Thud. And again. Thud. It was like trying to demolish a pyramid with a toothpick. The heat in the confined space of the passage entrance was stifling, the air thick with his own grunts and the metallic tang of his sweat. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, his arms were trembling, his vision was blurring at the edges, and the granite looked, if anything, even more smugly self-assured. Nock took over, his brute strength initially seeming more promising. He swung the mallet with a savage intensity, roaring with each blow as if trying to intimidate the stone into submission. The thuds were louder, certainly, and a few more satisfying chips flew off. But granite, Kenneman knew, wasn't about quick victories. It was a battle of attrition, and the granite had all the time in the world. Nacht's Herculean efforts soon devolved into frustrated, less accurate swings, one of which missed the chisel entirely and slammed into the rock face beside it, sending a shower of painful splinters into his own face. He recoiled, cursing loud enough to wake a mummy 3 tombs over, clutching his cheek. "Bleeding baboons," he roared, his voice muffled by his hand. "This stone is cursed by Set himself." "Probably," Kenneman agreed, his voice flat. "Or Neferkare was just exceptionally paranoid, or exceptionally wealthy and had a lot of enemies. Take your pick." He examined Nacht's cheek, a shallow cut but bleeding freely, adding to the general aura of sweaty, dusty, blood-streaked misery. This was the rhythm of their midday. One man hammering uselessly at the unyielding stone in the suffocating confines of the passage mouth. His companions offering unhelpful advice, swatting flies, or simply staring into the heat-blasted distance with the vacant expressions of men who had seen the true face of futility and found it to be made of granite. The physical breakdown was well underway. Kenneman's back muscles were locked in a permanent, agonizing spasm. His repaired sandal had given up entirely, and he was now working with one bare foot, which the scorching sand and sharp rocks were treating with appropriate disdain. His good hand, the one not freshly blistered, was cramping so badly he could barely maintain his grip on the mallet when it was his turn. Amos, after a brief wheezing attempt at the granite, had retreated, his face a ghastly shade of gray, his coughs shaking his frail frame so violently it seemed his bones might part company. Even Nacht, the powerhouse, was starting to wilt. The relentless heat, the impossible labor, and the constant irritation of flies and stinging sweat were grinding him down. His swings became slower, his curses more despairing than angry. The sheer impossibility of the task was a palpable weight, crushing their spirits as effectively as the sun was desiccating their bodies. Kenneman watched a bead of sweat trace a path through the grime on Nacht's forehead and considered the very real possibility that one of them might simply expire on the job. It wouldn't be the first time he'd seen it happen. Men died doing this. They died from heat stroke, from rock falls, from infections in untreated wounds, or sometimes they just lay down in the dust and refused to get up again, their spirits broken beyond repair. Then came the meal, if one could dignify it with such a term. Around what Kenneman guessed was the peak of the sun's tyranny, he called a halt, not out of compassion, but because continuing at this pace without some kind of intake, however meager, would be actively suicidal. They retreated a few paces from the tomb entrance, not far enough to escape the oppressive heat, but just enough to feel like they weren't actively being entombed themselves. The rations were, as always, a cruel joke. Kenneman produced his loaf of bread, which by now had achieved the consistency and approximate flavor of a sun-dried brick. He broke off a piece with considerable effort, the sound like snapping dry wood. It was coarse, gritty, and tasted faintly of despair. He He washed it down with a mouthful of water from his nearly depleted skin. The water was hot enough to brew tea, had a distinct flavor of goat and warm despair, and did little to quench the raging fire in his throat. Nacht gnawed on a piece of dried, salted fish that looked like it had been mummified alongside Neferkare himself, its aroma adding another layer to the already complex olfactory tapestry of their suffering. Amos nibbled weakly at a few shriveled dates, coughing between bites. Bach, who had brought nothing but his youthful optimism, now sadly depleted, looked on with wide, hungry eyes until Kenneman, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all the sands of Egypt, broke off another piece of his rock bread and tossed it to him. The boy caught it with a gratitude that was almost heartbreaking. "Don't choke on it," Kenneman advised. "It's probably more valuable as a weapon." There was no rest. They ate standing or squatting in the meager, shifting shade of their own bodies, the sun still beating down, the flies still feasting. It was purely functional, a desperate attempt to shovel enough calories into the furnace to keep the engine from seizing completely. Every swallow was an effort. Kenneman imagined rich merchants in Thebes, even now, reclining on cushions in shaded courtyards, servants bringing them cool wine and roasted duck. The contrast was so stark it was almost comical, if you were in the mood for comedy that tasted like dust and futility. He wasn't. The midday incident, when it came, was almost inevitable. They had returned to the granite plug, spirits at their absolute nadir, bodies screaming in protest. Kenneman was taking his turn, the chisel feeling slippery in his sweaty, blistered palm, the mallet an impossibly heavy weight. Each impact sent a shockwave through his already traumatized joints. His vision swam with black spots, the glare and the heat combining to create a disorienting, nauseating miasma. He could feel his grip failing, his muscles twitching uncontrollably. Just one more hit, he told himself, a mantra of misery. Just one more. He swung, but his arm, betraying him completely, spasmed wildly. The mallet missed the head of the chisel by a hand's breadth and struck his supporting left hand, which was braced against the rock near the chisel with a sickening crunch. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded from his knuckles, racing up his arm like fire. He cried out, a raw animal sound, dropping the mallet and stumbling back from the passage, clutching his hand to his chest. Nacht and Ahmose rushed forward, their own exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Bach just stared, his face paling to a shade that matched the limestone. Kenneman's vision tunneled. The world dissolved into a red haze of agony. He could feel blood, warm and slick, running down his fingers. Through the roaring in his ears, he heard Nacht's voice, unusually devoid of its usual surliness. "Gods preserve us, Kenneman." "Your hand?" Kenneman forced himself to look. Two of his knuckles were already swelling rapidly, turning a bruised, ugly purple. The skin was split, and bone, stark white against the blood and grime, was visible for a horrifying instant before the blood welled up to cover it. It wasn't just bruised, it was broken. Badly. His primary tool-wielding hand. Useless. The implications hit him with the force of another mallet blow. He couldn't hold a chisel. He couldn't swing a mallet. He could barely make a fist. In their profession, a crippled hand wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Or at least, a sentence to beggary. Passer wouldn't pay a man who couldn't work. Tai and the children. For a moment, the pain, the heat, the flies, the crushing despair of their situation threatened to overwhelm him. He felt a terrifying wave of dizziness, the urge to just lie down in the sand and let the sun claim him. This was it. The peak of suffering had been reached, and it was a landscape of broken bones, shattered hopes, and the mocking, unyielding face of a granite plug. Ahmose, surprisingly, was the first to react practically, tearing a strip of relatively clean linen from the inside of his own worn tunic. "We need to bind this," he said, his voice raspy but firm, "and get out of this accursed sun." Nakat, for once, was silent, his face a mixture of shock and a dawning grim understanding. Even he knew this was bad. This was more than just a bad day. This could be the end of Kenneman's career, such as it was. As Amosi fumbled with the makeshift bandage, his hands surprisingly gentle, Kenneman stared at the entrance to Neferkara's tomb. The dark opening seemed to sneer at him, a gateway to treasures he would now likely never reach, a monument to his own monumental failure. The sun beat down, merciless. The flies buzzed, and somewhere, deep inside, Kenneman felt a tiny cold spark of something truly terrifying, the first flicker of genuine absolute hopelessness. The sun began its long, grudging descent, but any relief it offered was psychological rather than physical. The air remained a furnace, the rocks radiated stored heat like malevolent ovens, and the granite plug in Neferkar's tomb stood as impassive and infuriating as ever. Kenneman, his left hand now a throbbing, clumsily bandaged club of agony, was effectively useless for any task requiring dexterity or strength. He sat propped against a slightly less scorching patch of rock, a silent, grim-faced monument to a bad day getting significantly worse. His role had been unwillingly demoted from breaker to chief sufferer and occasional dispenser of cynical commentary. The monotony of the afternoon was a special kind of torture. For Nacht and Amos, it was the relentless, mind-numbing rhythm of thud-scrape curse-repeat against the granite. Nacht, fueled by a mixture of dwindling fury and desperation, had taken over the primary role of chisel-wielder, Amos grimly assisting by trying to clear the minimal debris with the shattered remains of his crowbar, or offering the mallet when Nacht's own arms cramped into uselessness. Each impact was a small, futile defiance against the inevitable. Progress was measured in dust, in tiny, almost invisible indentations that seemed to mock their Herculean, sweat-drenched efforts. The sheer, unending sameness of the task began to fray their already tattered nerves. Every swing of the mallet was like the one before. Every scrape of the chisel yielded the same pathetic result. It was Sisyphean, if Sisyphus had also been slowly baking in an oven full of flies. For Kenneman, the monotony was different. It was the monotony of pain. The throbbing in his hand was a constant, unwelcome companion, a relentless drumbeat counting out the seconds of his misery. He tried shifting positions, but every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his arm. The sun beat on his exposed skin, and the flies, sensing his immobility, treated him as a particularly enticing buffet. He closed his eyes, but the glare still pierced his eyelids, and the images that swam behind them were not pleasant. Passer's greedy smile, Ty's worried face, the mocking glint of phantom gold just beyond his reach. Mental degradation began to set in, insidious and dangerous. Kennemon, his mind adrift on a sea of pain and rising fever from his infected hand, found his thoughts wandering into strange, unsettling territories. At one point, he became convinced that a particularly large scarab beetle scuttling nearby was Neferkare himself, come to personally supervise their failure and perhaps offer sarcastic commentary on their technique. He blinked, and it was just a beetle, but the unnerving feeling lingered. He imagined his children's faces, then couldn't quite recall the color of his daughter's eyes, a lapse that sent a fresh stab of despair through him, sharper even than the pain in his hand. Was this how it ended? Not with a bang, but with a whimper, a broken hand, and the mocking laughter of a long-dead scribe. Nacht, too, was showing signs of the strain. His swings with the mallet became wilder, less controlled. He started muttering to himself, a stream of curses and disjointed grievances against the world. Twice he nearly struck Amos, who was trying to hold the chisel steady for him, a task made nearly impossible by Nacht's erratic blows, and Amos's own trembling exhaustion. "Hold it still, you wheezing old goat!" Nacht roared, his voice cracking. though the fault was clearly his own. Amosa, to his credit, just coughed and readjusted, his face a mask of weary patience. Even his lung capacity for indignation was deserting him. The afternoon crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a series of pathetic whimpers and a final demoralizing crack. Bach, who had been tasked with the relatively simple job of keeping the waterskins in the sliver of shade cast by an overhanging rock, had succumbed to the heat and his own terror. Kenneman, roused from a feverish doze by a subtle change in the oppressive silence, the cessation of Nakat's grunting, opened his eyes to see Bach slumped against the rock face, his skin clammy and pale, his breathing shallow. One of the precious water skins lay beside him, its contents slowly seeping into the thirsty sand. "By the withered teats of Isis," Nacht bellowed, his voice raw with fury and panic. He lumbered over to Bach, shaking him roughly. "You useless whelp! That's our water. Our water." Bach just moaned, his eyes fluttering. He was clearly in the grip of heat exhaustion, possibly teetering on the edge of heat stroke. Amosa rushed to his side, gently pushing Nacht away. "Shouting won't help him, you ox-skulled oaf. He needs to cool down." He tried to get Bach to sip from the remaining water skin, but the boy was barely responsive. As if to add a final cruel flourish to the scene, the head of Nacht's mallet, already stressed and splitting from countless blows, chose that moment to give up the ghost. During a particularly savage, frustrated swing against the granite, which he'd returned to in a fit of pique after Bach's collapse, the wooden head fractured with a loud crack, sending half of it flying off into the wadi, the other half dangling uselessly from the handle. Nacht stared at the broken mallet, then at the unconscious back, then at Kenneman's bandaged hand, then at the impassive granite plug. The fight visibly drained out of him, replaced by a terrifying hollow despair. He sank to his knees, the broken handle clattering onto the stones. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We're cursed. This tomb is cursed. Everything is cursed." There was no energy left to properly handle any of it. Bach was down. Their water was rapidly dwindling. Their primary striking tool was destroyed. Kenneman was crippled, and the granite hadn't yielded an inch. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and the stench of failure. Nacht looked ready to either weep or murder someone, possibly both. Amos, despite his own frailty, was trying to tend to Bach, his face etched with a profound weariness. Yet even in this abyss of misery, a few small, almost imperceptible human moments pierced the gloom. Amos, after making Bach as comfortable as possible in the scant shade, came over to Kenneman. He wordlessly took the remaining water skin, uncorked it, and held it to Kenneman's lips, letting him take a slow, careful sip of the warm, precious liquid. It was a tiny kindness, but in that moment it felt enormous. A flicker of shared humanity in the face of overwhelming adversity. Kenneman nodded his thanks, too exhausted and pained to speak. Later, as Nacht sat slumped, staring blankly at the mocking entrance of the tomb, Amos retrieved the one remaining functional, albeit dull, chisel. He picked up a piece of hard sandstone, and with painstaking slowness, began to try and sharpen the chisel's edge. It was a futile gesture, really. Without a proper mallet, and with only one old, coughing man capable of even attempting to use it, the granite was still king. But the quiet, persistent scrape, scrape, scrape was a small sound of defiance in the vast, crushing silence of their defeat. A flash of pride in work that immediately felt foolish, yet somehow necessary. Time, in the afternoon, had become a malevolent entity. At first, with the sun at its peak and the labor at its most intense, every minute had crawled by like a wounded beetle dragging an eternity behind it. The sun seemed nailed to the sky, refusing to budge. The shadows, when they finally began to lengthen, did so with agonizing slowness. Now, with their hopes shattered and their tools broken, time seemed to mock them by speeding up. The shadows stretched further, painting the wadi in hues of orange and purple, signaling the rapid approach of dusk. The deadline passer had set, once a distant concern, now loomed large. They had achieved nothing, worse than nothing. They had actively depleted their resources, injured their leader, and quite possibly were about to lose their newest, albeit least useful, member to the heat. Kenneman watched the sun's descent, his good hand clenching and unclenching. The throbbing in his injured hand was a dull fire now, his fever making the air shimmer even more. He felt a strange detachment, as if observing a particularly bleak play from a great distance. The destination, the riches within Neferkar's tomb, was no closer. In fact, it felt further away than ever, an impossible dream buried under tons of granite and a mountain of their own accumulated misery. The sun, a defeated tyrant, finally bled its last crimson rays across the western cliffs, plunging the wadi into a rapidly deepening twilight. The oppressive heat began to leach from the air, replaced by a deceptive coolness that carried the ancient, dusty scent of the necropolis and the faint, unsettling whispers of the desert night. For most creatures, this was a time of reprieve. For Kenneman and his crew, it was merely a transition to a different flavor of suffering, now garnished with new dangers and a fresh wave of urgency. Diminishing light in the city of the dead wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an invitation to every hazard that thrived in darkness. Hidden fissures in the rock, loose scree on treacherous paths, and the myriad creatures that emerged from their daytime lairs, scorpions, snakes, and things best left unnamed, all became significantly more menacing. More pressingly, navigating the labyrinthine paths of the necropolis, already a challenge by day, would become a nightmare in the dark, especially with an injured man and another teetering on the brink of collapse. The thought of encountering a Medjay patrol in the pitch black, when they themselves were half blind and exhausted, was enough to make Kenneman's good hand clench, despite the shooting pains it sent up his arm. There was no real evening push in the traditional sense of trying to finish a task. The granite plug had unequivocally won. Neferkare, the stubbornly secure scribe, could rest easy, his treasures, if any, undisturbed by this particular band of hopefuls. The push now was a desperate, ragged scramble against the encroaching darkness and their own failing bodies. Knocked, his earlier despair congealing into a sullen, dangerous resentment, roughly roused back. The boy was marginally more responsive, able to weakly sip water offered by Amose, but he was far from capable of walking unassisted. He leaned heavily on Amose, his head lolling, muttering incoherently about the sun chariot chasing him. "We have to move," Kenneman stated, his voice a dry rasp. The fever from his hand was making him shiver despite the still warm air. Every throb was a reminder of his failure, of the pain, of the bleakness of their situation. Pazar will be expecting us, or more accurately, expecting his loot. The thought of facing Pazar empty-handed, and with a story of utter failure and injury, was almost as daunting as another round with the granite. Almost. The idea of extended labor, of somehow salvaging this disaster under the cloak of night, was a brief, insane flicker in Nacht's eyes. Maybe if we just try a different spot on the stone, he began, gesturing vaguely with the broken mallet handle. Kenneman cut him off with a harsh laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "With what, Nacht? Our teeth? My other hand is not feeling particularly heroic right now, and you're wielding a splintered stick. Amos is about to cough up his sandals, and Bach thinks he's a gazelle being hunted by a celestial uber. Number. We're done here. The only thing we're excavating tonight is ourselves, out of this cursed hole." The crushing disappointment was a palpable entity, settling over them like the desert dust. All that effort, all that sweat, all that pain, for nothing, worse than nothing. They were leaving with less than they came with. Less water, broken tools, an injured leader, and a semi-conscious liability. The resignation was just as heavy. This was the gamble of their profession. And today, the house, or rather the tomb, had won, spectacularly. The journey back to their hovel was a masterpiece of understated agony. Kenneman, leaning heavily on a makeshift staff he'd found, probably a discarded piece of ancient scaffolding imbued with the misery of countless forgotten laborers, found each step a trial. His injured hand, now throbbing with a life of its own, was cradled against his chest. The poorly repaired sandal on his other foot had long since disintegrated, leaving his soul to the tender mercies of sharp stones and abrasive sand. Every jolt sent spears of pain through his hand and up his arm. His fever-addled brain conjured phantom shapes in the deepening gloom. Crouching jackals that turned out to be rocks. Slithering snakes that were merely discarded palm fronds. Nacht, sullen and uncommunicative, took the lead, his frustration radiating off him like heat from a blacksmith's forge. He didn't offer assistance, didn't moderate his pace for the injured or the weak. He just plowed ahead, a boulder of resentment rolling downhill. Amose, a true saint of suffering, half carried, half dragged the whimpering back, his own breath coming in ragged, wheezing gasps. It was a slow, stumbling, cursed procession, a defeated army retreating under the cold, indifferent gaze of a million stars. The anticipation of rest, however inadequate, was a distant, flickering candle in a vast darkness. But even that was tainted by the knowledge that the rest would be compromised by pain, by hunger, by the damp shared misery of their hovel, and by the looming dread of tomorrow. What would tomorrow bring? Pacer's wrath, certainly. Hunger, almost definitely. More pain, undoubtedly. As they stumbled along, exhausted conversations, or rather fragmented pronouncements of despair, punctuated the rhythmic shuffle of feet and Amose's persistent cough. Never, never again. That scribe, Nacht muttered, kicking a loose stone with savage force. May his ka wander thirsty for eternity. He probably planned for that, Kenneman croaked, trying for levity and failing miserably. Probably has a granite water skin. Amose, ever the pragmatist even in extremis, wheezed, Passer will not be pleased. This was the understatement of the epoch. Passer's displeasure usually involved a lot of shouting, threats involving men with very large muscles and very small vocabularies, and a distinct lack of payment. Let me worry about Pacer, Kenneman said, though the thought of it made his stomach clench. Right now, let's just focus on not falling into a forgotten burial shaft and becoming permanent residents. There were no plans made for tomorrow that anyone believed. Talk of trying a different tomb, of finding easier targets, felt hollow. A ritual recitation of hope in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The camaraderie, if it could be called that, was the delirious bond of men who have stared into the abyss together and found it to be rather poorly lit and smelling faintly of bat guano. There was blame too, mostly unspoken, hanging heavy in the air. Kenneman blamed himself for the hand, for pushing too hard, for believing Pacer. Nacht clearly blamed Kenneman for the entire fiasco, the granite, the broken mallet, possibly the alignment of the stars. Back in his lucid moments, probably blamed himself for being born. A near miss occurred when Nacht, not paying attention, nearly walked them into a known Medjay patrol route. It was only Amose's gasped warning. Hold. Listen. That stopped them. Hidden figures melting into the deeper shadows of a crumbling mastaba just as the rhythmic tramp of sandals and the low murmur of voices passed by, oblivious. Kenneman's heart hammered against his ribs, a painful counterpoint to the throbbing in his hand. The encounter, though avoided, frayed their last remaining nerve endings. The false hope of an end, sunset, had given way to the grim reality of a long, painful, and dangerous journey back, with the even grimmer reality of their failure casting a long shadow before them. The night was young, but they were already ancient with exhaustion and despair, and the hovel, usually a symbol of their squalid existence, now seemed like a distant, almost unattainable sanctuary. The hovel, when they finally stumbled into its familiar fetid embrace, was less a sanctuary and more a shared tomb for their aspirations. It stank of stale sweat, dust, and the faint, lingering aroma of Nacht's earlier fish snack, which seemed to have taken up permanent residence in the mud brick walls. The darkness inside was thick and absolute, disturbed only by the ragged sound of 4 men breathing, or in Moses' case, wheezing with the determination of a leaky bellows. The evening meal was a masterclass in gastronomic despair. Kenneman, his injured hand radiating a universe of pain, found the prospect of eating almost insurmountable. He still had a chunk of his brick-like bread, but the effort of tearing off a piece with one hand and his teeth, then attempting to chew and swallow the gritty, tasteless mass, felt like a Herculean labor in itself. He managed a few mouthfuls, each one a gritty monument to his misery, before giving up. The bread lay beside him on the dirt floor, an accusation in carbohydrate form. Nacht, his earlier rage now simmered down to a sullen, brooding silence, gnawed on the last of his mummified fish with a kind of grim determination, the cracking sounds echoing slightly in the small space. He didn't offer to share, not that anyone would have particularly wanted any. Sharing implied a surplus, and surplus was a concept from a different, more pleasant dimension. Mose, after settling back onto his own mat with a murmur of something that might have been encouragement or a prayer for a swift end, produced a few dried figs from a pouch. He ate them slowly, methodically, each chew punctuated by a soft cough. He offered one to Kenneman, who waved it away with his good hand. The thought of the sticky sweetness combined with the dust in his mouth and the throbbing in his hand was nauseating. Back, still weak and dazed, managed a few sips of the now dangerously low water supply Mose offered him, but showed no interest in food. Food was for the living, and Bach seemed to be hovering in some desolate antechamber between worlds. Bodily maintenance was a futile, almost comical ritual of self-deception. Kenneman, with Amos's surprisingly gentle assistance, unwrapped the makeshift bandage from his hand. The sight was not encouraging. The knuckles were swollen to twice their normal size, a grotesque landscape of purple, black, and an angry, inflamed red. The cuts were oozing a pale, yellowish fluid, and the entire hand felt like it was on fire. Amos clucked his tongue, a sound of profound disapproval directed at the state of the injury rather than its owner. He found a rag that was only slightly less filthy than the previous bandage, and after dipping it in their precious, dwindling water supply, an act that caused Nacht to grunt in protest, attempted to clean the wound. Every touch, however gentle, sent jolts of agony through Kenneman. He gritted his teeth, tasting blood where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek. Just wrap it, he gasped. There's no healing this with wishes and dirty water. Amos rebandaged it tightly, the pressure a new form of torture. Nothing felt clean. The grime of the tomb, the desert, and their own sweat was ground deep into their skin, their clothes, their very souls. Kenneman could already see tomorrow's problems. The infection worsening, the potential for losing fingers, or worse, the use of the hand entirely. Pacer would love that. Repairing equipment was out of the question. The broken mallet handle lay in a corner, a symbol of their utter defeat. The chisels, dull and abused, were scattered nearby. No one had the energy or the inclination to even gather them properly. What was the point? They were instruments of a failure so profound it felt like a physical entity in the hovel with them. Social time, if it could be called that, consisted of brief, exhausted grunts and the occasional burst of gallows humor, so dark it was practically invisible. "Well," Kenneman said, staring up at the hovel's dilapidated roof, through which a few indifferent stars were visible. "At least Neferkari got a good story out of it. The day the 3 idiots and a half-wit tried to tickle my granite." Nacht snorted. "He's probably in there now, laughing his linen-wrapped head off." "Or," Amos wheezed, after a paroxysm of coughing, "he's complaining to Anubis about the noise. Can't a dead scribe get any peace around here?" Back whimpered softly in his sleep, dreaming of sun chariots, or perhaps a world without tomb robbing. Someone was always sick. Tonight it was Bak, clearly still suffering from heat exhaustion, and Amose, whose cough seemed to be excavating his lungs with renewed vigor. Someone was always angry. Tonight that was Nacht, radiating silent fury like a banked furnace. And Kenneman? Kenneman was just broken, in body and increasingly in spirit. Yet these shared moments, these pathetic attempts at humor, these acknowledgments of their collective suffering, were the thin, frayed threads that kept them tethered to their own humanity, however tenuously. Without them, they would just be animals, scrabbling in the dirt. Pre-sleep rituals were exercises in futility. Kenneman tried to find a position where his hand didn't scream quite so loudly. He lay on his side, cradling it. He lay on his back, letting it rest on his chest. Nothing helped. The throbbing was a constant, malevolent presence. He checked for scorpions by feel around his mat, a habit too ingrained to ignore, even when his primary concern was whether his hand would still be attached to his arm by morning. He could hear Nacht shifting restlessly, muttering curses under his breath. Amos was trying to muffle his coughs, a hopeless endeavor that only made them sound more violent when they finally broke free. And then came the failing to sleep, the cruelest irony of all. Exhausted beyond measure, their bodies screaming for oblivion, their minds refused to grant it. Kenneman lay in the oppressive darkness, the pain in his hand a pulsing beacon keeping him tethered to a miserable consciousness. Every small sound, the scuttle of a beetle, the distant howl of a wild dog, Nacht's monumental snores that soon rattled the very foundations of their squalid dwelling, was amplified, grating on his raw nerves. Amos's coughing fits would jolt him back from the very edge of sleep, each one a reminder of the slow decay that awaited them all in this profession. His mind, a tormentor in its own right, replayed the day's failures in excruciating detail. The snapped sandal tie, the splintered crowbar, the mocking face of the granite, the sickening crunch of his own bones, Pacer's imagined fury, Ty's worried eyes, the children's hungry faces. These images swirled in the darkness, a relentless carousel of anxiety and regret. What would they do tomorrow? How could he provide for his family with a useless hand? The questions looped endlessly, each one a fresh jab of despair. The heat, which had lessened slightly with the setting of the sun, still lingered in the hovel, a close, suffocating warmth that made the reed mat sticky and unpleasant beneath him. He could feel sweat trickling down his temples, the itch of insect bites on his exposed skin. He longed for the sweet oblivion of sleep, but it remained elusive, a cruel tease. Hours passed, or perhaps it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning, replaced by the endless, throbbing present. Eventually, through sheer unadulterated exhaustion, his body began to betray his mind. The sharp edges of his anxiety started to blur. The pain in his hand receded into a dull, monstrous ache. He drifted, not into peaceful slumber, but into a fitful, shallow state of near unconsciousness, populated by disjointed dreams of falling rocks, laughing mummies, and an endless, unyielding expanse of granite. Whether this qualified as sleep or merely a brief suspension of active suffering was a question for philosophers, and Kahneman was decidedly not in a philosophical mood. He was just a weary wanderer, lost in a night that offered no rest, only a brief, troubled pause before the miseries of a new day inevitably dawned. Kahneman's disastrous day, his throbbing hand, Nacht's simmering rage, Amos's rattling cough, and Bach's sun-addled terror were not unique. They were a single wretched verse in an epic poem of human misery, an ode to the forgotten, the desperate, the men and women who clawed a living from the edges of powerful empires. While pharaohs postured for eternity and priests chanted their anodyne hymns, an unseen army toiled in the shadows, their existence a testament to the stark realities that lurked beneath the gleaming surface of civilization. Just how many Kahnemans were there, risking life, limb, and eternal damnation for a few trinkets or a sack of grain? Precise numbers, of course, are buried deeper than any pharaoh. Bureaucrats of the Black Land were more concerned with counting bushels of wheat and heads of cattle for taxation than with conducting a census of those who operated outside the sanctioned economy. But we can be sure they were legion. Tomb robbing wasn't an occasional hobby. It was a shadow industry, a grim profession passed down through families, a desperate resort for those with no other recourse. In a society with a vast gulf between the opulence of the elite and the grinding poverty of the masses, where nobles were interred with literal fortunes while families starved, the temptation was ever present, and for many, irresistible. Historical records, like the great tomb robbery papyri from the 20th dynasty, give us glimpses into this world, revealing organized gangs, corrupt officials, and a surprisingly widespread network for disposing of illicitly gained goods. These weren't just isolated acts of opportunism. This was a persistent feature of Egyptian society for millennia, waxing and waning with the strength of the state and the desperation of its people. From the early dynastic period, engineers were already trying to design thief-proof tombs. That they consistently failed tells you everything about the pervasiveness and ingenuity of the robbers. Even the famed intact tomb of Tutankhamun was breached at least twice in antiquity. Kahneman was not an outlier. He was part of a vast, sweating, cursing, and largely invisible fraternity of the damned. Some robbers were even the very workmen who built the tombs, using their insider knowledge to their advantage. Others were laborers, craftsmen, even low-ranking priests. A cross-section of the working poor and the slightly less poor who saw an opportunity or a necessity. Why was this role of tomb reappropriation specialist so stubbornly persistent? From Kahneman's perspective, the necessity was brutally simple: survival. His children needed to eat. His wife, T, deserved a life slightly less precarious than perching on the edge of starvation. The official channels offered him little, back-breaking labor in the fields for a pittance that barely covered the grain tax, or perhaps hauling stones for some grandiose project that would bring him no glory, only a sore back and an early grave. Tomb robbing, for all its terrors and uncertainties, offered a sliver of hope, however faint, of something more, a chance to grasp a tangible piece of the wealth that was otherwise so far beyond his reach. It was a gamble, a dangerous one, but the alternative was often a slow, grinding surrender to poverty and oblivion. For many, it was a way to provide for their families when other avenues failed, or when leaders, perceived to have failed in their duty to provide for the living, were seen as deserving of such retribution. From a darker, societal perspective, one could almost argue with a mouthful of bitter irony that these men performed a kind of grotesque economic redistribution. Wealth, hoarded in staggering quantities for the eternal comfort of a select few, was, piece by painstaking piece, chiseled out and reintroduced, albeit violently and illegally, into the parched economy of the living. Gold that would have sat uselessly in the dark for millennia might be melted down, and find its way into the hands of a craftsman who could then feed his family. Linens meant to shroud a mummy might instead clothe a shivering child. It's a twisted sort of trickle-down economics, where the trickle is facilitated by a copper chisel and a healthy disregard for curses. Of course, the grand achievements of Egyptian civilization, the pyramids that scraped the sky, the temples that dwarfed mortal men, the intricate art that still captivates us, were all built on a foundation of immense labor, often brutal and unrewarded. The irony that Kenneman sought to plunder the products of such labor, himself a laborer of a different, more illicit kind, was probably lost on him in his daily struggle. He wasn't thinking about economic theory. He was thinking about his next meal and the ever-present threat of the Medjay's pointy sticks. The life of a tomb robber like Kenneman was steeped in bitter ironies, sharp enough to cut deeper than any shard of pottery. He delved into the earth to unearth luxuries he himself would never legitimately enjoy. Gilded coffins, delicate jewelry, fine oils, and potent wines, meant for a king's afterlife, not a poor man's fleeting comfort. If he was lucky, his share might be a few deben of gold or silver, quickly exchanged for everyday necessities before it attracted the wrong kind of attention. He helped, in his own destructive way, to build the mythos of Egypt by scattering its artifacts, yet he lived on its absolute fringes, a pariah in the eyes of the law and the pious. He violated the eternal rest of men and women who had spent fortunes ensuring their corpses would remain undisturbed, all so he could snatch a few more fleeting moments of existence for himself and his family in a world that cared little for their survival. The concept of ma'at, order, balance, justice, was for the wealthy, for those whose tombs were protected by spells, by stone, and by the fear they inspired. For Kenneman, ma'at was a distant abstraction, less relevant than the sharpness of his chisel or the desperation in his belly. He and his ilk were a necessary disruption, a chaotic response to an ordered system that often left them behind. Why do we remember Ramses the Great and forget the countless Kennemans who, in their own way, shaped the fate of his treasures? History, as they say, is written by the victors, or at least by those who could afford the papyrus and the scribes. Official records would only speak of men like Kenneman in condemnatory terms, as criminals, blasphemers, violators of sacred space. Their confessions, often extracted under torture, survive as testament to their capture, not their lives. The punishments were designed to be brutal and exemplary: impalement, burning, amputation, a clear message that their kind was not to be tolerated, let alone celebrated. The grand narratives focus on the builders of empires, not the dismantlers of their tombs. The pharaohs commissioned the monuments, the priests consecrated them, the nobles were buried within them. These are the stories of power, of legacy, of an idealized order. Kenneman's story is one of desperation, of transgression, of the messy, uncomfortable realities that underpin even the most glorious civilizations. He left no monuments, only disturbed earth and plundered chambers. His legacy was not in stone, but in the scattered remnants of lives he briefly touched with his illicit trade, and in the whispered tales of those who dared to defy gods and kings for a chance at survival. And here lies the final, perhaps most uncomfortable reflection. The pattern endures. Kenneman's world of stark inequality, of desperate risks taken for a meager share of hoarded wealth, is not confined to the sands of ancient Egypt. The names change, the settings shift, the commodities evolve, but the fundamental dynamics of exploitation and the grim calculus of survival echo through the ages. We don't need to preach or draw heavy-handed parallels to see the ghostly outline of Kenneman in those who toil in unregulated mines, in those who salvage from the waste of richer nations, in those who operate in the gray economies of the modern world, driven by the same stark choices: risk everything for a chance, or passively accept an unbearable fate. His weary, cynical spirit, his aching body, his desperate hope for his family. These are timeless human realities when the dice of fortune are cruelly loaded. Kenneman is long dead, his bones likely as scattered and forgotten as those of the minor nobles he disturbed. But his struggle, in 1,000 different guises, walks among us still. And that perhaps is the most haunting legacy of all. So, what became of Kenneman, our weary Egyptian tomb robber with the perpetually sore back and the freshly mangled hand? History, as we've established, rarely bothered to record the finer details of men like him, unless it was on a particularly grim list of executed criminals. There are no statues of Kenneman, no papyri lauding his exploits in breaking and entering the afterlife. His name, if it was ever spoken beyond his immediate, equally desperate circle, is now just dust motes dancing in a sunbeam over forgotten sands. The odds were never in Kenneman's favor. For a man in his profession, life expectancy wasn't a statistic. It was a morbid punchline. If the back-breaking labor, the poor sanitation, and the ever-present threat of disease didn't claim him, the job itself had 100 ways to do it. A collapsing tunnel, a misplaced blow from a mallet, as he so painfully experienced, a venomous snake disturbed in the dark, or the tender mercies of a rival crew fighting over the same spoils. Any of these could provide a swift, unceremonious exit. And then, of course, there were the authorities. Discovery meant a particularly unpleasant and public end. The official punishments for tomb robbery were designed to be theatrical deterrents. Impalement was a crowd pleaser, as was being burned alive or having various useful appendages, like hands or noses, forcibly removed. Confessions were often extracted through methods that made even Kenneman's disastrous day with the granite plug look like a pleasant afternoon stroll. Given his recent injury and the utter failure of their expedition, his immediate future with Pacer, their disgruntled employer, was likely to be fraught with threats and financial ruin even if he avoided the Medjay. Could he have escaped this life? Unlikely. With a crippled hand, his value as a breaker was nil. He might have descended further into the dregs of society, perhaps becoming a beggar, his tales of woe ignored by passers-by. Or maybe, just maybe, T's resilience and his own desperate cunning might have found some other, slightly less perilous niche for him. But the chances were slim. Men like Kenneman didn't usually get retirement parties. They got hasty burials in unmarked graves, if they were lucky enough to get buried at all. He was a disposable component in a system that thrived on such disposability. Did Kenneman leave a legacy? Not in the way a pharaoh did, with towering monuments designed to trumpet his glory for millennia. Yet, in a strange, twisted way, he and his countless unnamed colleagues did leave something behind. The artifacts they liberated, those that weren't melted down or broken, eventually found their way through complex networks of trade and theft into the hands of collectors, and centuries later, into the climate-controlled display cases of museums around the world. So, in a profoundly ironic sense, Kenneman, the destroyer of archaeological context, also became an unwitting contributor to its eventual study. His knowledge of secret entrances, of the hidden ways into sealed chambers, might have been passed down, a shadowy oral tradition of illicit expertise. The routes he trudged, those paths of desperation leading from squalid hovels to the silent cities of the dead, are metaphorical tracks still followed today by those pushed to the margins. The basic techniques of forcing entry, of assessing risk versus reward, are timeless, adapting to new locks, new vaults, new forms of hoarded wealth. And the systems of exploitation, the societal structures that create such a chasm between the haves and the have-nots, that a man would risk eternal damnation for a few pieces of gold? Those, alas, have proven remarkably durable, more enduring than granite. But let's not forget that beneath the grime, the cynicism, and the crushing weight of his existence, Kenneman was human. He wasn't just a statistic or a historical footnote representing the desperate poor. He loved. His thoughts, however grim, returned again and again to Tai, his wife, and to his children. Their imagined faces were the flickering candle against the suffocating darkness of his fear and his pain. He hoped, however briefly and foolishly, that moment when the boulder rolled, revealing the tomb entrance, that was hope, pure and potent, even if it was immediately crushed. He found meaning in small, grim things, a correctly identified weak point in a stone blockage, a shared unspoken understanding with Amos, even the bitter satisfaction of a well-aimed curse against a particularly malevolent deity. We don't need to romanticize him. He was a thief, a violator of sacred traditions, a man driven by needs that often trampled over the desires of others, albeit others who were long dead and excessively well provisioned. But his humanity lay in that very struggle, in his weary endurance, in his sarcastic wit that spat in the face of despair, in his refusal to simply lie down and be forgotten, even if history ultimately forgot him anyway. He felt pain. He felt fear. He felt the burning injustice of a world that offered him so few good choices. So, the next time you find yourself complaining about your morning commute because the air conditioning in your chariot is on the fritz, or because the barista spelled your name wrong on your cup of imported spiced latte, spare a thought for Kenneman. Picture him, if you will, halfway up a sun-blasted wadi, his water gone, his hand a mess, with Nacht grumbling about curses and Amos coughing up a lung, all for the chance to maybe, just maybe, steal enough gold to buy some stale bread for his kids, while simultaneously trying to avoid being impaled by a grumpy medjay. Suddenly, that slightly too long queue at the organic grocery store doesn't seem quite so tragic, does it? You get to go home to something other than a mud brick hovel probably infested with scorpions and the palpable despair of your companions. You might even have a job that doesn't list divine retribution as a potential occupational hazard. Count your blessings. Kenneman certainly didn't have many to count. Let's leave Kenneman there, at the end of his brutal day, not as a hero, certainly not as a villain worth remembering, but as an emblem of countless forgotten lives. Picture him, slumped on his wretched mat in the pre-dawn gloom of the next day, his good hand instinctively checking the tools he can no longer effectively wield, his broken hand a throbbing, agonizing testament to his latest failure. His eyes are gritty with exhaustion and the ever-present dust, staring into a future that looks as bleak and unyielding as a granite plug. He is broken, yes, his body battered, his spirit bruised. But somewhere in the set of his jaw, in the flicker of his weary eyes as he hears T's name whisper in his memory, there's a spark of something that refuses to be entirely extinguished. Endurance. A stubborn, stupid, fundamentally human refusal to simply cease. He is forgotten by the grand sweep of history, a single grain of sand in the vast desert of the past. But he was there. He lived. He suffered. He hoped. And in remembering his struggle, we remember the countless invisible hands that built, and sometimes unbuilt, the foundations of our world. Kenneman, the weary wanderer, forever toiling in the shadows. May his ka, wherever it is, finally find some peace, or at least a tomb with slightly less robust security.